Okay, so let's start with the introductions with our panelists. Ken, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I appreciate it. Thank you, Sophia. My name is Ken Oliver, and I'm the Executive Director of the Checker Foundation and Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility at checker.org. We're a background check company, and I'm excited to be here today to talk about this very important issue of DE&I and sprinkled with a little fair chance. Sophia, how about you?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia Yamauchi, and I lead the Emerging Talent Programs team here at Asana. Emerging Talent encompasses university programs and apprenticeship programs, which are the programs that we have in place for individuals breaking into Asana from non-traditional, underrepresented backgrounds. And I've been at Asana for a little bit more than 2 years now. So I will pass it over to Jehron.
Hello. I'm Jehron, founder and CEO of ColorStack. ColorStack is a 501c3 collegiate membership organization for Black and Latino computer science students. And with particularly in this space, we work with teams like Sophia's to work with their university programs to help them increase diversity of their intern and new grad programs.
Great. It's really good to see you all, and thanks for joining us today as our panelists. So we have, this is a very interesting topic, top of mind topic for all of us, as well as a lot of the audience here. So let's start with a kind of a big question. So I will call out Ken again as a first person to answer, but I want to hear from all of you. What is the most difficult part of implementing a D&I program? Because we all, want it, everybody's interested in, but what is really the biggest challenge when you're trying to implement this?
It's a great question, Sophia. I appreciate you asking it. I'd like to start off by just saying, I think difficulty is a subjective word. I think it depends on who the individual is. And I'd segue into, it starts with leadership. It starts with intentionality of leaders who want to be intentional about creating a fair and equitable, inclusive workforce. Oftentimes leaders can be prone to what's happening in the market. And so they react to things like the George Floyd or what everybody else is doing, right? And while that may be good, like on the surface to say, hey, let's hire a chief diversity officer, let's start a DEI initiative. Is that really truly intention that comes from the place that a real D&I program has to come from, which means really from the heart, that you're people-centered, that you believe in inclusivity, you believe in equity as a human being, not just as an initiative that is one program amongst many. So I would start just by saying intentional action and cascading down messaging from leadership that this is what the company culture is. So that's number one. Number two, the other difficult part is then delivering like metrics and measurements. Like, what do you measure against, right? And when I get asked this question, which I get asked often, I typically say that your company should probably reflect the makeup of society. And so if there's a 12% population of Black people, for example, 12% of your company should probably be Black people. If there's a 20% Latinx population, then your company should probably reflect that. And that's a pretty good gauge, because that's a pretty good indicator of what's happening in your community. It's what's happening in society at large, and is a true reflection of the American business ecosystem. So those are two things that I would flag right off the bat, is intentional leadership and then using metrics that reflect what's happening in society.
Yeah, thank you. How about you, Sophia?
Yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't have said it better than what Ken just shared in terms of starting with leadership and the people who are leading those that people look up to. And I think another component, I would say two themes on my end, in addition to what Ken shared, are education and clarity. So there's a Maya Angelou quote, do your best until you know better, because when you know better, you do better. And I think it's really important to give people the grace of learning and creating space for that. And so whether that's creating, there's active learning, like the mitigating bias and learning about the different aspects of how people can be a participant and be an ally and show up. But there's also the continuous enablement that's really important to ensure that people can do better and know better throughout their process of participating. And the other component around clarity is making sure people understand your why. And that really ties in with the component of making sure that leaders are invested in demonstrating and sharing their investment and passion about making these programs come to fruition, but ensuring that everybody is crystal clear on why you're driving the programs forward that you're driving, who's involved, who the stakeholders are, who's doing what, and how people can participate. And I'll pass it over to Jehron to share a little bit more about his answer.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I see it. I notice this from a different angle, right? Because I'm on the other side of the effects of the DEI programs that companies are building, and what we've talked about with our partners and some of the challenges that they've had really comes down to trying to figure out the balance between storytelling and quantitative success. Because sometimes you do a lot of, and especially to your point, Ken, about people who really get it and do it because it's right, you can still get caught up in the feeling of success versus measured success, right? And so what, I don't want to say I've been advising them, but I've been just kind of trying to collaborate with a lot of our partner companies to balance a really great story where, a ColorStack member who was considering dropping computer science, but went to this one event with a particular company, and now they stayed in computer science and got an internship at that company. And, it's a nice kind of put tears in your eyes, maybe story. How can we balance that with real metrics of success that can not only dictate and influence decisions that you make for your team, for your DE&I program, but also get more buy-in from execs, right? It's easy for that to get cut off if it's only stories and only feel-good experiences. But when it's actually moving the needle on some business metric, or you can actually prove that these dollars are going towards a number that's going up and to the right, it's much harder to cut that off. It's much easier to take it seriously.
Yeah, I think, and then which kind of nicely ties back to my next question, which is like, what are some of the best practices for measuring D&I in the hiring process? Because I agree with, I think what you've said, Jehron, and everyone, it's we need both the storytelling, and heart, as well as the brain part, like how, what's the business impact we're driving, why this is also, how is this program going? We are investing a lot to make it work, but how is it going? So there are many metrics, whether it's a progress metric or success metrics, we want to be able to quantify. So what are some of the things that you've seen that was really powerful and effective? Because also I think like a lot of business initiatives, some things are harder to measure than others, right? So I'd love to hear from your experience. What are some of the best practices?
Ken, Ken, I would actually love to hear you talk about a specific thing that you mentioned in our last talk, which was, some of the statistics around formerly incarcerated folks, like retention within the org, and some of these other things that you've noticed, and how that has been a good way of selling success of these programs.
Sure. So, at Checker, we specialize, we do kind of a very progressive version of DE&I, because we believe that starting with the baseline makes it a lot easier to have other different types of diversity. And so we go out of our way to hire people who have been involved in the criminal justice system from all different backgrounds, all up and down the corporate ladder. We have people that come into customer success, candidate experience. We have software engineers. We have people in marketing, comms. We have people who are executives and VPs at the company who have been formerly incarcerated. And what's interesting about it is that when you take a group of people, and I don't think this is exclusive to formerly incarcerated, but any group of people who have been marginalized in society, right? Who have been told that they're less than because they're LGBTQ, or because they're a woman, or because they're Black, or because they're Latinx. And you provide space and opportunity for those people to thrive, right? The results are exponentially higher in a positive way than they are even for just normal people that may have walked out of UC Berkeley and Stanford. Because the pride and the loyalty that occurs as a result of being given an opportunity and being included, which is the word of inclusivity, does wonders for the human spirit and gives people dignity, for some people, for the very first time in their life. And so what we found with our people, in the 6 years we've been doing fair chance hiring, we have absolutely zero recidivism rate. People in our company reach promotion faster and at a higher clip than people who have never had any kind of justice involvement. They're the most loyal employees. We've had one person in 7 years leave the company, and that was to take a promotion at another company. No one has dropped off. People are here every single day, first to arrive, last to leave. And they've also been cultural ambassadors, right? They've galvanized people in the company who may not have known anything about criminal justice, who see folks thriving in a way that maybe they themselves thought maybe they couldn't if they were faced with that type of adversity. So I think, that, and then, I just want to just hit one time on my friend Larry Miller from Nike, who was justice impacted himself and did 10 years in prison, but went on to build a brand with the Jordan brand to a multi-billion-dollar brand based on his lived experience. And so when we think about diversity and inclusion, we often think of race. And the reality is what we should be thinking about is diversity and inclusion of lived experience. Because based on the experience that I've lived, which is different than yours, I have a value proposition that you don't. And you also have a value proposition. So the more value propositions you can bring into any business, doesn't matter the business, right? It's all about perspective and what I see versus what the next person sees or vice versa. I think you're adding value to your product, to your service, to your culture. It just makes it richer. It's contextually more richer. And it's also shown from a business case to add to your bottom line, which I know a lot of businesses are interested in. Sophia, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit. It's interesting, Ken, what you said about the metrics that you're tracking of the individuals that you're presenting opportunities to that wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to be in their role are seeing higher promotion rates. The retention rates are higher. We see a lot of the same themes through our apprenticeship program at Asana. Of all of the apprentices that we've brought on board so far, 100% are still with us today. And it's truly amazing and impactful to see how they grow not only throughout the experience, but also throughout their time once they convert to a full-time role and continue growing. And they really, what we found is the participants of our programs are, of course, enabled with all of those different factors of growth mindset and hard work. And it's amazing to see that when you're creating an opportunity to invest in someone, how far that will go. Sophia, you had mentioned the question around best practices of measuring DE&I in the hiring process. To get a little bit more granular, in addition to the broader themes that Ken had mentioned, one of the things that, or a few of the things that we do, or I would say the three themes, if you're looking in the hiring funnel itself, you can probably boil it down to understanding, tracking, and then assessing. So first, understanding, where are your candidates coming from? Are they coming from partners? Are they coming from platforms or referrals? How do you deeply understand the market of the pipeline that you're bringing on board? Tracking, how are you tracking self-reported data as candidates are coming through the process? And then, of course, assessing your conversion metrics. So if you're looking at the top of the funnel and you have a really strong pool of underrepresented candidates, and you notice ultimately none of those candidates make it to the offer stage, that's an indication that you have a problem. So, what do? You keep asking why until you uncover that root cause and investigate. You might find that candidates are converting at specific stage, but dropping off at the next stage. So that really gives your team insight into what you can improve and how you can do better moving forward. I will caveat that in terms of tracking self-reported data, it's really important to consult your legal team or employment lawyer to make sure that you're using or you're storing and using the data properly. But the more insight that you can gather there, the more data that you can actually use to make an informed decision.
Yeah, I have nothing to add there. That was those are two really good answers.
I would add one piece to that. I think companies can really measure also about the number of applicants they get. Like I've heard a lot of companies say, "Oh, well, no one's applying, or we don't have a big pool." Well, that's an indicator that you can be proactive. Like, where are you facilitating inclusivity events? Where are you going to recruit? Are you working with companies like Jehron's? Are you going to places that you may not normally go to? Are you going to places where Latinx or Black people or LGBTQ people tend to frequent, mixer events, et cetera, and actually meeting people where they're at, waiting for people to come to you? And that, again, goes to intentionality of leadership. Like, I think if leadership is sending the message like, hey, you need to go make this happen, then people feel empowered. Companies can feel empowered to go to some of these places and be proactive to actually recruit people that are not the usual suspects in applicant pool. So we have to be proactive if people aren't coming to us.
Right. And then as you said earlier, Ken, when you're kind of setting more of a baseline of where we want to be in terms of our makeup of team members, and if we're thinking it's like should it reflect the makeup of our broader society, then you can also see, okay, where are we seeing the discrepancy? Because there, when company is, even in the random sample, like there can be discrepancy, but it's like what is the statistically significant discrepancy in a certain segment of your population, and then it's like, yeah, you need to commit some resources to correct that, because it's not going to just correct itself by doing the same thing, right? So you do need to think about it and then launch a specific initiative to compensate for that and adjust it. So I really like that. It's kind of using the data and measurement and then connecting that back to action. Okay, how do we actually go about correcting that? So that's great. How about the next question is, when you think about, the industry as a whole, where do you think companies are missing the mark when it comes to diversity initiatives? Is that kind of at a certain point in the hiring funnel, like kind of a pipeline, the channels of a candidate, or is that more broader, like the retention is actually more of an issue that you know prevent you from hiring the right people because they don't see anybody already thriving at your company? So I'm curious to hear, like, what have you noticed as like one of the areas that really we have an ample opportunity to improve?
I would say I like to approach it just a little bit differently and say what companies are doing right.
Mm.
I don't want to steal any of Sophia's thunder because she's excellent on her own, but like what companies like Asana are doing, creating apprenticeship programs across sectors for all different sorts of populations that may have been underserved, is a great start. I'm a big fan of apprenticeship programs. It's a in-house hiring initiative that companies can take on themselves that doesn't take that much work to do. I think creating intentional programs to go out and meet the community where they're at, as I mentioned earlier, is another proactive tactic that companies aren't doing enough of, right? Creating and being intentional about measurement and metrics, like rather than just saying like, hey, we're doing a DEI program, or we have a label that says like we hire here, right? Like it's not just that, because to your point, Sophia, the moderator, these things aren't going to fix themselves, right? And so if we want to buy into this notion of the future of work, and this is important from a business standpoint, like 20 to 30 years from now, like you're going to have to open up the way that you source talent, whether that's somebody that's just as involved, whether it's somebody from an HBCU, whether it's somebody that's LGBTQ. These are the facts of American social life and pop life. This is where your talent is coming from. And if you want to continue to innovate and be at the front of the curve, you're going to have to create programs and figure out how you can meet the candidate where they're at and incorporate and fold them into your company. And it ends up being a win. All the data shows it's a win-win, right? Millennials want to work around people that look like them, that act like them, that have diversity and social impact programs. And businesses have shown to flourish more when they incorporate these types of programs. So it's a short-term investment, long-term payoff.
Yeah, I focus mainly on the, intern new grad side, which I think is a really great kind of piece of the DE&I work that's being done, because you're starting at, the earliest stages and kind of new grad, people finishing boot camps. You have a chance to like really change the face of the next generation. And so what I think some companies don't really think about enough is how they, what their criteria are for interns, right? And even you could even extend that to new grads. Like I was under the assumption, if you look at history into like apprenticeship programs and things like that, you learned how to become, a blacksmith or whatever by just looking at someone who already was one and watching them for like 3 years, and then you learned all you needed to learn, and now you became one, right? And so somewhere along the line, we went from apprenticeships to internships, and we just forgot the core essence of like learning. Where when I was in school, a lot of people who were getting internships, for example, to work on React or like some front end framework, already had 3 years or so of like part-time student experience using those frameworks. And I'm like, well, if even for an internship you need experience, then how are we really going to change anything here, right? Why can't this student who has high potential, right, who is interested in the company and resonates with the brand and kind of the product and the users that you solve problems for, why can't they get a shot to learn over a summer, versus someone who, regardless if they do your internship or not, they're going to be good. They're getting a software engineering job in industry once they graduate. So that's one thing I'm trying to start having more conversations around, and many companies are doing not only apprenticeship programs but also early ID internship programs for freshmen and sophomores, so that it can be more based on education and taking people who have little to no experience but just an interest in, and then they can get a return offer for that junior internship. So I really like seeing that. So that's kind of like both what I think many companies aren't doing right, but then some of the companies I work with closely here at ColorStack are investing in those early stage programs. I'm actually at the Duolingo office right now, and they have a program called Thrive that they do for sophomores, which I'm very, very excited about.
Yeah, that's amazing, Jehron. And in addition to what you shared, that tacks on to one of the things that we focus on very heavily, which is really understanding the root of the problem first. So many companies invest heavily in diversity initiatives, but there's a difference between getting someone to the application as opposed to ensuring that they have the resources and enablement to make sure that they make it through the end of the interview cycle. So with Asana Up, for example, we host a series of educational workshops on interviewing and assessment preparation. And we provide ample opportunities for candidates to interact with Asanas, learn from them before they even get to that first stage of the interview process. And the reason why we do that is because we understand that everyone's coming from a different background. Like Jehron said, everyone's coming from maybe no internships at all, or maybe they have several and they've had that opportunity, but we want to help to level the playing field a little bit more and ensure that they have all of the information and education to feel confident to really move forward to that next step of getting a chance at the opportunity.
Yeah. And it's kind of an interesting thing, one, and I think, Jehron, you're probably also seeing, because especially in the software kind of jobs, like there is a kind of I think it starts with like, oh, we will have an internship for seniors, and then like a couple of years later everybody's doing that, and then now the norm is like, oh, you need to have a 1 year before you apply to the that internship, and then it kind of becomes more competitive, right?
Yeah.
And then I think then you kind of about, it was meant to be that we focus on potential more than experience at that early kind of early career talent. So it's interesting to hear that that's what you're observing, and like your effort to also remind company, hey, no, I mean students will also learn, right? Or like I heard from my friend who was a couple years ahead of me that I need to start that first. And I think it's also kind of what Sophia, you said, like if you know about it, right, like earlier on somebody in your life, or past cross paths, like told you that that's something that everybody's doing, like that itself is a power, right? Like knowing that is power. And then you can kind of get involved in it. I'd love to also kind of dive in even further on the early career talent section and hear about like how you can also, because I do think it's a lot, that's also the big kind of a volume of a hire companies usually make, right? Like experience hire, it's kind of based on as the position opens up, there is like a sprinkles of a different volume of hires that comes in. But I feel like the early career talent is like kind of a more larger programs and more absolute number of people companies usually hire for. So I'd love to hear how do we use that as a kind of a way to also make a lot of progress on DE&I initiatives?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of kind of what I mentioned too, just about intern programs and kind of how you go about picking the cohorts of students. And I mean, I was talking to some recruiters recently, and Sophia, you're probably seeing this as well. Like, we're getting to a point in the university space where like students are creating bots to just auto apply to every company that has a software engineering intern title on their careers page, right? And so because it's no longer, you could argue against obviously, but it seems to me like it's no longer about awareness, right? Like, students have all these GitHub pages of all the companies that have internships and doing bots. So you don't really have to as much focus on putting the role out there and kind of getting more people to apply. Now you can invest more efforts in figuring out who you actually want to bring in, right? Before, it was all about getting job postings on newsletters and on job boards and things like that. But I've seen a lot of companies now, for example, Squarespace, they're like, we're going to get 8,000 applications. Like, that we already know that's going to happen. So all of the dollars and all the time that they spend in the recruiting season is engaging with students who really, really want. Like, how do we take that 8,000 and bring it down to 800 and bring it down to 80, right? And so there's much more bandwidth to now think about how can we, to Sophia's point, how can we invest in talent development, right? How can we offer experiences for these students who are, trying to apply to this role? How can we prepare them for the process, right? How can we show them about CodeSignal and prepare them for what that's going to be like? How can we educate them on mock interviews, because they literally didn't even know what technical interviews were prior to applying, right? How can we invest more in talent development? And we're doing a lot of that with our companies as well. So that's one thing that I definitely have seen. The other thing is making sure you do have a nice cohort experience that's also has an in-person component. So I talk to a lot of students every day, and a lot of them aren't feeling too engaged in this virtual first world, where the ones that are really enjoying their experiences on their new job, they're telling me that, oh yeah, we had a 1 week in person, everybody flew in, onboarding week. And yes, they're remote now, but that was so impactful. Or students who had an internship where the whole internship was remote, but they had 1 week that was intern week where all the interns came and connected with each other. So I think, another thing that isn't being talked about enough, because to the point earlier, maybe, fully virtual and kind of more hybrid workforces are working for parents, right? And people who are, a little bit more established in industry and are more comfortable in their professionalism. We're talking about students who are getting in their first job, right? And maybe don't have enough confidence to reach out to folks in a Slack after just joining, right? This is their first experience. And so they need, and they're attracted to companies that are going to help them build themselves up as professionals and be able to grow as professionals at that first job.
Yeah, I would love to just double click on something Jehron said about using this as a strategy to develop talent, right? And going back to even having skill building programs within your internships or apprenticeship programs. The labor market is tough out there. And one of the ways that companies can leverage against that is by committing from, again, a leadership standpoint, to say we're going to take an academy model and actually grow our own talent from within. And then if you take that approach, what you're able to do is you're able to take people who may not be from traditional backgrounds, may not have a traditional education, and you actually provide the skill-based training within your own company. And then that can take the form of, like I said, internships, apprenticeships, et cetera, and so forth. But that skill-based training and development is key. And it's a mindset that a company leadership has to have, that they're going to that approach of developing talent, especially in this current market. And I think it's only going to get worse.
Yeah. Right. I think just to round it out, in addition to what Jehron and Ken said, going back to the partnership piece, how are you investing in partners? Like Jehron said, that companies that are hiring early career talent get thousands and thousands of applicants. And so who can you go to that, which partners can you work with that are aligned with the values of your programs? And how can you find synergy there? So for example, partnering with ColorStack or partnering with organizations like Next Chapter to really invest in the programs and people that are doing the work and aligned to the vision that you're working toward.
Always a +1 to partnering with ColorStack. Thanks for the shout.
Yeah. How about also kind of a like what can I mean, I think we need kind of a see this holistically, as well as also like when it comes to enablement, there's a skill side, there is also soft skill side, and exposure and mentorship, all that. What are some of the I guess advice that you have for how companies can kind of uh, frame that, like, right, because it is kind of a investment, but I do think that's like there are a lot of benefits, right? Like if you do that, you will be able to kind of have access to the talent who are well calibrated to succeed at your organization, but also you also create that reputation of, oh my god, this company like provides a great training, and even if I don't get converted to be like a full-time member, like I still take away something that I can take, transferable skills that I can take anywhere. So have you kind of found a way that really helps the leaders at organizations, like why this is important and how to help them kind of see?
Yeah. I think it always goes back to data is your most helpful tool. So using that same model of understand, track, and assess, and then also add on implement. So understanding your candidates, as mentioned earlier, where are they dropping off in the funnel? Are candidates particularly succeeding in the design and coding interviews, but dropping off in another portion if it's specific to engineering? So diving deep into your metrics and your funnel and your candidates and understanding where are they thriving, and then where are your candidates also struggling? And then if you can really dive deeper into those struggle points, working closely with your engineering partners or your business partners or whoever it is on the other side that is invested alongside you of hiring great diverse talent, of helping to build and create content that will be the most helpful. So it's not as much of throwing something at the wall and thinking, hey, this might be helpful, but understanding and truly knowing where your candidates are struggling, and then building content and workshops and resources enablement around that. And yes, it does take a bit of stakeholder partnership and buy-in to make sure that that can come to fruition, because there's so many people involved. But I think the benefit of working alongside people who also care about the same mission and who share those same values is one way to get more people involved. And that's what we see at Asana is the people who come into Asana are already invested in this same value shared model. And we see that in addition to their core job, this is something that, if we're all striving towards something better, then everybody takes part in it. It's not one person's job to just create the workshop or make that next step.
Yeah, 100%. I would +1 on that. I mean, like Asana, who does great work at Checker, it's built into our company culture. Like we're committed to building a fairer future of work. So when people come into Checker, they already understand what the culture is. So it's a great majority of people come to Checker because of Checker's mission and for having something higher that they can work for towards every day. So when it's time for speaker series or designing workshops or doing volunteering, like our offsites in more than a few occasions are inside prisons. So like to build community and build empathy and be able to build some of those things that can come and be brought back to the office where we can enhance the culture. It gets everybody involved. It's a great galvanizer. So yeah, I would +1 to what Sophia said about, embedding that in the culture and making it intentional.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. I know I said we will address the questions at the end, but I think there is a kind of a relevant question to the thread that we had. So we just talked about also like the early career talent. How about what has been some of the successful initiatives, and this is rephrasing the question coming from the community, for hiring experienced or leadership talent?
You want to take that, Sophia?
I can start and I'll pass it to you. So I think, this isn't as much my world, but we're all in this together and working towards the same goal. And I think a lot of it circles back to some of the same themes that we've talked about, right? So going to the communities that you want to invest in, that you want to continue creating opportunities for, it's instead of assuming that people will find your job, actively taking part and also giving back and contributing. So not just saying, hey, we're showing up to this community event and we want candidates to apply, but what can you do for the candidate? How can you demonstrate that this is a place that they would want to work? How can you demonstrate that you are not only investing in this one event, or you have a specific kind of cut and dry goal, but that you want to invest in this person as a human and really take care of their professional career and see them through to the future, not just this one instance.
Yeah, that was some drop the mic stuff that Sophia just did. I don't know how I can follow that, but I will say that like we have a very progressive model at Checker, where we've created Checker University, and we're very proactive about developing leaders amongst the justice impacted population that we serve. There's 2 points. There's the first point of, are you hiring and recruiting at all levels of the career ladder? Or are you like getting sucked into that thing that we can get sucked into, which is, oh, we have these like entry level jobs and this may be a great place to like bring people in at? Because I can tell you that, when you look out at the ecosystem, and those of us who are involved understand that there's all levels of people, all the way to executive directorships and VP level people that are doing wonderful jobs at companies all across this country, who may have been like just as involved, or somebody that you wouldn't normally expect to be in those kind of positions. I gave Larry Miller as an example earlier at Nike. So I think that there's that point. But then also, once you get people into the company and you recruit people successfully into your company, making sure that there's a robust leadership and development program within your company, that requires investment again. But developing leaders and placing people at the center is important. It's a difficult conversation, because that means if you're centering somebody else, that means somebody else is not being centered, right, in a given time. And so that equity piece starts to come into play. Are we giving equitable opportunity and development for people who aren't the traditional people that we give leadership and equity to, right? And I think that if we do that, the data shows that you get a better result for the company. You get a better result in the culture, right? And your company is just in front of the curve and more innovative when it comes to resourcing and human resources.
Yeah, I would just plus one to that last point, Ken, because I mean, we're focused on students on my end, but yeah, like the strategy could be to not, put a ceiling at entry level, right? Like there's a lot of companies that do really well with intern programs and entry level folks, becoming more diverse, but then you go up one level and it's just like what the entry level used to look like a couple of years ago, right? So, developing those, and I hear a lot of students asking about this as well. Like, what are the clear paths to growth, right? Like in the company, like, what's the ladder look like? What's the development opportunities that are there for them to grow as an engineer, and figure out if they want to be a manager or just a stronger IC. Like the talent, if you've already done the entry level talent job well, then there are people right there that can become your mid level and your senior talent.
Yeah, I think investing in the current as well as the future talent makeup of your company is important. Yeah, but we don't want to stop at just entry level jobs, because representation really matters, and I think it's like retention also matters, right? If those people don't see examples of people, a diverse makeup of leadership, then it's also almost a signaling there is a glass ceiling. Okay, we said you are a diverse company, but there is a glass ceiling, and that discourages people from being able to get there, right? So I think that's a good reminder for us to have a strategy for the current makeup as well as the future, but it is an investment all around, and it's not only for, as Ken said, it's specific group of people. I think the companies, like a lot of it is also education around like how to be a good manager. Nobody just like knows from day one, right? It is something that everybody has to learn. How to be a good leader. I think that's also a big topic. Like, you don't just wake up one day and know everything. So it is through both like the individual's effort, but also company's commitment in developing talent within. Yeah. Cool.
I think too, Sophie, I think that if we buy into the notion that every person has a value proposition, and we don't think as leaders in a company that we have all the answers, right? Which is tough. Like oftentimes we like can lean towards that sometimes, to think that we have all the answers for everybody and we want to save society. We have the answer for this community or that community, right? It's the colonialism kind of mindset, right? And I think that once we can establish the value, it makes it a lot easier to be inclusive of all different types of people, right? And saying that, hey, this person has a tremendous value to add with their seat at the table. And I think if we take that approach, it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah. And then maybe one kind of a last question, and then we can move on to the Q&A before we need to wrap up. But how do we? So I think when I also think about DE&I, I think so. Maybe also reflecting my own personal history, right? Like I started my career in a very kind of a white male dominant investment banking, and at the time I actually didn't think about DE&I. I focused a lot on survival. I focused on not highlighting that I am different, but more that I can do the job better, right? So I almost like did not talk about that I was different, or I have different needs, or I am bringing different perspective, because if I said I am different, I might be seen as less. I think that was all subconscious thing, but I think that's what was going on. So how do we also create a culture and sense of a belonging to the team members who might, I think some people might want to educate the broader community and be outspoken, kind of a let's drive the change, but some might be a little bit more conscious about like, I want to just like be a the best marketer, not known as the diverse marketer, right? So how do we kind of create that conversation or culture? What have you seen that's helpful?
Something I've seen that's helpful is, instead of putting things in front of people to create a better culture or a sense of belonging, is actually creating space to listen and learn from people, and creating a safe space for this conversation to happen. So Sophia, I don't know in your experience if there was ever a space set aside for you to speak up or voice your opinion, where you didn't have to be Sophia coming in as a woman in the industry and a minority in the industry, but more so someone coming in as someone that wanted to voice their opinion alongside others who wanted to hear from you, alongside people who wanted to support you as an ally. So an example of this at Asana, we have a series called Real Talk. And this was created to really encourage authentic discussions on issues that are important to various communities. And some of the things that we do is we bring on panelists to speak to a variety of topics that focus on issues that are coming and stemming within underrepresented groups. And all are welcome to attend and take part in this real, authentic conversation. And I think that a huge part of it is just encouraging both, the panelists and attendees to speak their minds, and enabling them to learn from one another and really have these honest discussions to overcome some of these challenges, communicating purpose, and really driving positive change. And I think that only is made possible because there's a safe container created up front and a sense of psychological safety. And so I think if that's implemented, it has to be done in a very thoughtful way, as to where people can actually step in and feel safe amongst one another.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm noticing that we are almost at time, and there were a couple questions. I'm gonna rapid fire some of them and see if we can get a quick answer. None of them is a quick answer question, but I'll try. So one is, how do you counteract comments such as, we just hire or promote the best person of the job, regardless of race or gender? Like, so the argument about like performance is the most important one, or the skills. How do we?
I could talk about how we counteract that at Checker, because if you say you're just hiring the best person for the job, there's like almost an implicit bias built into that, right? That the best people for the job are people that aren't people of color or people that don't look like you. It's tough, right? Because we've been conditioned this way, right? In corporate America. But I think that if you go outside of what your normal sourcing and hiring patterns are, you'll find that in actuality that the best people for the job oftentimes are the people that look like you or aren't the people that you normally source from. So if you're only sourcing from one group, it's easy to gain that perspective, right? But if you're at HBCUs actively, if you're at other places in the community, meeting people where they're at, you'll find some of the brightest, shining brilliance that you've ever seen imaginable. So it's also about exposure, right? If you've never been exposed to communities of color, if you've never been exposed to communities of justice impacted people, if you've never been exposed to LGBTQ communities or veteran communities, naturally you're going to say, oh, we're just hiring for the best for the job we're hiring over here. Well, first, in order to know that, you got to be over in the other communities first, right? And so if you don't have that proper sampling and experiential experience, then you're not going to have the context to be able to know who the best person for the job actually is.
Yeah, thank you. And the next question, there are more questions coming in, so let's look at that. How would you create a DE&I program for a religious company that only hires from a specific population?
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, that's a real interesting question, right?
I mean, I think the one thing I think of is just the idea of intersectionality, where like you can figure out, like D&I doesn't necessarily mean, like there are certain countries in the world that don't have the same D&I issues and kind of things that we do. We're a very unique country, right? Where we have this like kind of melting pot of a bunch of different cultures. And so D&I is actually way more important, or better said, it looks different, right? Versus if you have, you know, a country or area or a demographic that seems more monolithic in terms of you all have the same religion or come from the same background. There's still, you know, gender within that population. There are still preferences in terms of like who you are as a person. So like, you know, introverts versus extroverts, or people who are interested in certain kind of hobbies and other things like that. Like I think there's always differences in a group, right? So you can kind of identify those differences first of all, and kind of build out programming and resources and kind of figuring out your D&I program in that way, not just thinking about it from a racial perspective or even a class perspective or anything like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's also about there are different dimensions about diversity than kind of a religion as a one. So yeah. All right. Maybe we'll take one more question and we might have to follow up for the rest of the questions after the webinar. But okay, so when we look at D&I data, what are the key things we should be measuring to ensure that we create and foster D&I and making an impact to our organization? I think this might have been addressed from our earlier section. So maybe we will do one last question really. Any recommendations for small startups at a like less than 20 people? At a small startup, a lot of infrastructure doesn't exist yet.
I think a part of it goes back to what Ken said in terms of having DE&I stem from leadership, and then also tackling on addressing your why. Why are you building these things? And then lastly, how do you build it into your culture? Who you bring on board so that it's everybody's job and not just one person's job. That especially in a startup environment where everyone's wearing 10 hats, why not make that something that is just as important as the initiative that everybody else is working on?
Yeah. And also I think go ahead, Jehron.
Oh, no, I was gonna say I agree, and I think, you know, I think they're right. The person who's asked like about the fact that you're less resourced, you can't go to all the conferences, you can't, you know, do all the things, you can't have an ERG, you're trying to survive as a company. And so like Sophia said to Ken's point earlier, you know, if you bake that into who you're bringing into the company and looking for people. For example, like if you're hiring a people manager, it might be worth asking, have they promoted, women before on their teams, or have they had, Black or Latino folks on their teams in the past, right? I don't know if it's a direct question or maybe a reference or how you would get that information out. But if you just bring people into that 5-10 person startup that already do it like a lifestyle, where they don't have to sponsor an org, where they don't have to come up with a new program because they just know it and do it and live it, that also helps. It might take a little bit more time and intentionality in the hiring process, but at least it's not extra money per se. You don't have to go to a conference or have an ERG. You're kind of just bringing people in and looking for that in the hires that you make.
Yeah, and I think there is no too small of a size to start having a clear kind of a discussion and culture and value around diversity. You can have 2 people and then you can start that discussion and be clear about that's what we're committed to as a company, right? It might take some time for that to manifest, but yeah, I think that's another way to always keeping that in the core part of their culture and values. Yeah. All right, I know we are a little bit over time, but it was so good to see all of you, and thank you so much for your sharing your insights and experience and expertise with us.
Thank you for having us.
Have a good one.